we are going to continue with our final presentation. One more to go, and it's going to be interesting. It's going to tie some of these things together, I think. And so without further ado, we're going to hear from Mr. Ben Miller. So here we go.
Good afternoon. If you look at 19th century fencing history, you'll see numerous references to something called physical culture. Many fencing masters practiced and or taught some form of physical culture or so-called gymnastics, a related term used almost interchangeably at the time. For instance, everyone you see here was a famous 19th century fencing master or instructor that also taught or practiced physical culture. George Roland, whom you see on the left, wrote an entire book on gymnastics. Colonel Monstry, reputed survivor of 50 duels, taught both fencing and physical culture in his academies. Ella Hatan, America's champion swordswoman, ran a school for physical culture. And Maestro Greco, one of Italy's most renowned masters, also practiced physical culture. So what exactly is physical culture? Physical culture was a term that arose during the early 19th century and which was used to describe a movement or series of movements in the West pertaining to physical exercise, and which included calisthenics as well as exercises with popular apparatus of the period, such as the wand, dumbbell, Indian club, and others. It's important to note that in this context, the word culture was not used in the sense that we use it today, describing the, quote, customs, arts, or achievements of a group of people. Rather, culture was used in the earlier sense of, quote, the act of cultivation, the art of improvement and melioration. So in a general sense, 19th century physical culture refers to the, quote, cultivation of the physical. So it's very clear that this connection with fencing exists during the 19th century. The more elusive question is, why does it exist? And what is the nature of that connection or relationship? To understand that and to see the fuller context, we're going to briefly step back in time, because the association between fencing and exercise goes back much further, to the Middle Ages at least. From that period, you can find all sorts of images, such as the one you see here, that show fencing being practiced alongside other forms of physical exercise. The important thing to know is that as far back as the late Middle Ages, there is this idea that fencing imparted benefits beyond purely the domain of self-defense, that its regular practice could also help cultivate health and well-being. This idea continued throughout the Renaissance, when you can still find many such images. And the fencing authors of the period frequently acknowledged the health benefits of fencing. This includes de Grassi in 1570, Saviolo in 1595, and George Silver, who in 1599 writes, quote, "The exercising of weapons putteth away aches, griefs, and diseases. It increaseth strength, and sharpeneth the wits. It giveth a perfect judgment. It expelleth melancholy, choleric, and evil conceits. It keepeth a man in breath, perfect health, and long life." Now, let's dissect this quote for a moment, because it's really interesting. So first, he lists the obvious physical benefits, increasing strength, as well as the health benefits, putting away aches, diseases, keeping a man in perfect health, etc. But then we get to something even more interesting, sharpening the wits, giving perfect judgment. So this is a mental dimension now. Silver is claiming psychological or neurological benefits from the practice of fencing. And then it gets even more interesting when he mentions an emotional component, putting away griefs, expelling choleric, that's irritability or temper, and expelling melancholy. Melancholy is basically depression. So there's this idea that regular practice makes you emotionally healthier as well. And then perhaps the most interesting part, expelling evil conceits. So during the period, a conceit is an idea. So Silver is saying that the practice of fencing helps you expel or avoid evil thoughts, evil ideas. So this is now a moral or spiritual benefit that he is claiming. It's very much in line with the thinking of physical culturalists in the 19th century, few or none of whom I'm sure had read George Silver. A little bit later, you also have fencing masters actually including sections in their treatises on gymnastics, or in the case of Irish master Alexander Doyle on the right, he writes an entire volume about it. And I've read at least one historical account that in Sweden, a fencing master was required to teach gymnastics as well. And this brings us to the 18th century. a time when doctors and physicians really began to take notice of fencing. In 1772, Dr. Benjamin Rush, a Philadelphia physician and American founding father, recommended fencing to his patients, as you can read here. So once again, like Silver, he mentions both the physical and the mental benefits. And we also have writers on gymnastics and athletics, such as the French military surgeon, Joseph Clement Tissot. And among many things, he writes, quote, "Fencing contributes more powerfully than any other exercise to the increase of strength, to the agility of the body, to the correction of bad attitudes and certain deformities of the body." And he goes on to suggest its usefulness as a medicine. And this is something you start to see a lot more of as the century progresses: medical essays and texts which mention fencing as an exercise to regain and or maintain health. So moving into the 19th century, in 1805, we have the publication of the Code of Health and Longevity by Sir John Sinclair of Edinburgh, which becomes a highly popular series. And in the first volume, Sinclair includes a section on fencing in which he outlines its many physical benefits, its curative powers, and its contribution to longevity. And in volume 2, published the next year, Sinclair includes a lengthy letter from fencing master Henry Angelo, in which he discusses his very specific ideas on what he feels are the health benefits of fencing. But even at this time, with all these connections between fencing and health and exercise, we still haven't arrived at the concept of physical culture. But that starts to change early on in the century when different European movements arise, leading to the creation of a number of methods and schools for exercise. And they start to codify this idea of physical culture and put into words exactly how fencing fits into it. And this more or less begins with an extraordinary individual from Sweden named Per Henrik Ling, who creates one of the first true methods of physical culture, which goes on to become the most influential method on all of 19th century physical culture. And it happens like this. Ling is a fencing master. He's trained by 2 French fencing masters. And in the process of becoming a fencing master, he finds that the practice of fencing cures him of his chronic joint rheumatism and partially paralyzed arm. And he becomes fascinated by this idea that not only is fencing for self-defense, but that it is also curative. And so he takes that information and creates a new, highly systematized method of physical exercise, which he terms educational gymnastics. Essentially, what he does is he takes some of the positions, body mechanics, movements, and ideas from fencing, but no longer with self-defense as the objective, and adapts it purely for self-development, creating a holistic system with its fundamental principle expressed as, quote, the oneness of the human organism, the harmony between mind and body. And fencing isn't the only influence on his method, but it's a major one. And this system is first taught in Ling's fencing cell, and it will become hugely popular, spreading throughout Europe and America. In fact, it is brought back to France and taught by fencing masters and the military there. So it's of immense significance that the single most influential physical culture method of the 19th century was inspired by fencing, designed by a fencing master, and first taught out of a fencing cell. And in looking at some of the movements and positions in his method of calisthenics, you can see the clear fencing influence. You can see it in the footwork, in the similar angles and orientations that are also used in both. And you can see here how Ling's system was influential on other methods. On the left, you can see the Swedish fallout position A with sideways flexion, which is basically a sideways lunge with the torso facing to the side and aligned with the straightened leg. And you can see the same position at center appearing later in the German Turner method using a wand, and on the right in the US Army drill used with dumbbells as late as 1905. However, these calisthenics aside, there were other branches to Ling's method besides the educational gymnastics. And in one of them, termed military gymnastics, fencing is taught in depth. And this is important. Fencing is not something considered separate or divorced from Ling's physical culture method. It is considered part of it, a facet of it. And you also see the same approach taken by the other major physical culture movements that follow. So what are these other movements? Well, a big one is the Turner movement in Germany, which is founded in 1811 by Friedrich Ludwig Jahn. And Jahn's first system was divided into 3 groups. And the first category, elective exercises, included fencing. So just like the Swedish method, Jahn's original method includes fencing as a major part of the curriculum. And like the Swedes, the Turners have a holistic approach to both the physical and mental, the very motto of the Turners being, quote, a sound mind in a sound body. Now, this expression is important. It comes from the classical Latin phrase mens sana in corpore sano, from the ancient Roman poet Juvenal. And it is adopted as a motto by many subsequent physical culture movements, and even the UK's Army Physical Training Corps and Royal Marines. A version of it also inspired the motto of the YMCA, founded in 1844 in London. They added the word spirit and expressed their aim as the development of a healthy, quote, body, mind, and spirit. And the motto, a sound mind and a sound body, is also taken up by the Sokol organization, founded in Prague by Miroslav Tirs in the former Austro-Hungarian Empire. And similar to the Turners, the Sokol spreads through Bohemia, Lower Austria, Slovakia, Moravia, Serbia, Croatia, Slovenia, and eventually the United States. And just like the Swedish and German methods, the Sokol includes fencing in its organized curriculum. Specifically, their branch 4 of their Department of Combative Exercises is fencing. And in addition to these major national movements, you also have a huge variety of methods propounded by individual instructors, especially in places like the UK, France, and the Americas, where people are not as unified behind a native national physical culture movement. And in a number of them, you can see the various ways in which the author instructors were integrating fencing positions or movements. So to give just a few examples, here we have Madame Brenner, who publishes the book Gymnastics for Ladies in London in 1870. And she includes an exercise using foils made of cane, which includes the movement of the salute, going on guard, and the lunge. So she's adapting elements of fencing to an exercise for self-development. In some of these methods, positions and movements from stick, bayonet, and quarterstaff fencing are adapted into various physical culture routines, which were typically choreographed and performed in sync with music. And in some cases, such as what you see here, one would suddenly transition between a standard wand or barbell position directly into an on-guard position or into another position from fencing. You will also see the interpolation of fencing terminology into some of these methods. Footwork is one obvious example. You see quite a bit of fencing terminology in the footwork. And as you see here, the term moulinet is brought into Indian club swinging from fencing, although the term is applied differently by each of the different nationalities, American on the left, Italian at center, and French on the right. So they're all being adapted in different ways. Now, these are just a few of numerous, almost countless examples. But although you can find these interesting technical and terminological interpolations here and there, they are really the most superficial aspect of the relationship between fencing and physical culture. Because where you find the truly deep and meaningful connection is in the general goals and objectives of the two disciplines. In other words, the more of a macro perspective you take on the relationship between fencing and physical culture, the more substantial connection you find. So what are the overlapping objectives? Well, we already know that the aim of both is the cultivation of mind, body, and spirit. But how does that fit into the physical part of physical culture? Here we get into an important point. To briefly relate this to the present, exercise as it is generally popularly practiced today in 2021 focuses on building strength with some flexibility and cardio. This would not be considered physical culture during the 19th century. They actually had a term for it at the time, muscle culture. And the physical culturalists tended to look down on muscle culture because they saw it as being non-holistic and the focus on strength coming at the expense of numerous other important attributes. Colonel Monstery, who is both a fencing master and physical culture teacher, writes about this, and he says, quote, "There are good systems of athletics that tend to health and long life, and bad ones which tend to shorten life. The bad systems are those which overtask the strength by severe strains, requiring long training, so-called, to produce an artificial state of the system, fitted to endure the strain for a time. These systems are those which produce large muscles at the expense of vitality, too large for the heart and lungs behind them, too large for the vital force that moves them. They all tend to shorten the life." So physical is not just muscle. It also includes the skeletal system, the nervous system, respiratory, circulatory, digestive, the skin, the eyes, the brain, and much more. So physical culture is factoring in a lot more, as does fencing, because again, it's considered a branch of physical culture. And here are just a few of the other things they focused on in terms of the physical. Strength, of course, flexibility, both static and mobile, circulatory system, balance, equilibrium, posture, carriage, skeletal alignment, suppleness, elasticity, agility, nimbleness, finesse, poise, elegance, deep breathing, because there are actually different schools of breathing at the time, vim, vitality, energy, longevity, which everyone talks about, and even elements of diet and dress. And then we have the mental aspect, because the way they saw it, the brain was part of the body. It's not a separate thing. So the mind is directly affected by physiology and vice versa. As one author of the period writes, quote, "An active mind may wear out a weak body, or a deranged body may cloud the clearest mind. Those who would have a sound mind should have a sound body, and the soundness of the body depends very much upon a proper observance of physical laws. Within the body is the mind." So what are the shared mental aspects between physical culture and fencing? We have neuromuscular control. That's basically a fancy way of saying the body does what you want it to do, how and when you want it to do it. Mental agility and speed, learning difficult skills, because a lot of these exercises are complicated. Precision, exact execution. Memory, a lot of these exercises combine the movements into a progression that is challenging to remember correctly. A sense of time, rhythm, which is why they were often done to music. Understanding of economy of motion. So one treatise actually states, quote, "It is not to see how much the muscles can be made to do, but how little they may do, and still affect the object of a balance wheel to the whole system," end quote. Spatial awareness and synchronized coordinated activity, again, because these are often done in groups. So again, the brain itself is physical, and teachers believe that these exercises practiced consistently could keep neurodegenerative problems from arising, which is why, like classical fencing, they could be practiced well into old age. Which brings us to the third category, the spiritual, which is probably the most elusive and difficult to understand. So as you can see from the quote at the top here, quote, "The body is the tool by which mind and spirit do their earthly work." So although the spirit is not part of the body, it is connected to the body and to what you do with it. So how does that work? One of the more obvious objectives is the cultivation of moral ideals. And in one physical culture pamphlet, the author writes, quote, "Chivalry in Europe, Bushido in Japan were systems of conduct which were inseparable from various plans for physical training." So these are things that are inculcated through instruction from the teachers and the social groups. But how are the exercises themselves conducive to morality? Well, just as George Silver wrote about, quote, "expelling evil conceits," there is this idea that if you do not cultivate your physical mental well-being and practice regularly, you can become depressed and irritable. But that regular practice of these exercises, both martial and non-martial, makes you less depressed and less irritable. So the exercises make you feel better, and the emotional calm and stability they brought about also made you able to better make morally sound decisions in other areas of your life, having an effect on your mental state beyond just the salle and gymnasium. And this is really an ancient concept that goes way back, exercising to ward off melancholy and evil thoughts. So it's not that it affects your free will or necessarily your desire to do good or evil, but that it puts you in a less impulsive, less irritable, less depressed, and more calm and stable state of mind in which you can make life decisions. So it helps develop self-control. And also that it keeps practitioners, especially the youth, focused on something positive and healthy on a regular basis. It basically keeps people out of taverns and the bad parts of town where they could get into trouble. And this was one of the main goals of the YMCA. And so you see now the spiritual and moral aspects of these disciplines. So that is the real substantial connection between fencing and physical culture. And as we've already seen, the reason why they have so many shared goals is because they arose from a culture with the same objectives in mind. And also because fencing masters had a direct influence on these methods. And if you're wondering what happened to it all, well, during the 20th century, a massive cultural shift took place towards spectator sports and games at the expense of holistic physical culture. So the primary goal was no longer cultivating mind, body, and spirit, but about winning. And at the same time, classical fencing becomes almost completely displaced by modern Olympic sport fencing. This is not a coincidence. So fencing and physical culture are not compartmentalized, and they are all being affected by these larger issues and massive cultural trends in very similar ways. And that brings us to the end of our lecture. I hope you've enjoyed it and learned something about fencing and physical culture.
So do we have Mr. Miller with us to take a few questions? I'm not sure if he had to go since we are running a bit over time. Well, it looks like we may have lost Mr. Miller.
No, he's there, but he needs to
He's on mute.
unmute.
Okay. It does. All right.
Can you hear me now?
Yes.
Yeah.
Okay, sorry about that.
So, so we have a few questions coming in. So I think just to turn on the last question that came in first, which is, you know, I guess a couple of questions. We'll do them linked, which is the first. At the end of the lecture, you had mentioned that with the refocusing on competitive sports, on the culture of winning, you know, in the 20th century, there was a turning away from the earlier ideals and practices of physical culture. And, you know, as anything that got into a competitive context, fencing was also influenced by that shift. Was it something, I mean, I guess there's a question about, well, what actually was the impetus for that shift? I mean, was it wrapped up in some of the crashing of nationalism after the First World War, or was, you know, there's some other, you know, forces at work that were really turning physical development from something that's almost like cultivation oriented to let's go and win, like for my team or my side?
Well, from my perspective, it really didn't have much to do with nationalism, because nationalism certainly continued. It did not die out in the 20s or the 30s, which is when you really start to see this huge shift. Nationalism was very alive and well. So from my perspective and what I've researched, it really has to do with this massive cultural trend, which you see everywhere in the West, which is the focus on spectator sports and games. And also the rise of, so with the rise of spectator sports and games, you see that sort of take center stage. In terms of physical cultivation, which still exists as well, exercises, you see the bodybuilding aspect. So really what the 19th century people refer to as muscle culture, you see this really sort of push all that other stuff out. And there's actual conversations that happened at the time. There's an amazing letter published in a Turner magazine in America, where in I think the 20s or the 30s, and the author, who's a diehard Turner, is just ranting against the rise of spectator sports and games and how people don't want to really do old school physical culture anymore, that this is something that's starting to be seen as antiquated. And for him, from his point of view, it was because it was really the spectator, the desire to please the spectator was driving this change. The spectator, people were saying, yeah, when I go to a stadium, it's cool to see 3,000 people doing these perfectly synchronized physical culture exercises, but it doesn't really get your blood pumping, and it doesn't really excite you like it does when you see people, two different teams struggling for dominance to grab a ball or get it through a goal. So to me, that those are the two major shifts is you see this focus on sports and games, which everyone at the time is talking about. And in terms of the exercise and the physical cultivation, you see all of the mental, spiritual, and a lot of the physical aspects, which I talked about in the lecture, are just completely give way to muscle culture, to just cultivating musculature, to bodybuilding, to strength, to cardio. Some flexibility was still there, but that was more sort of for warm up and cool down. It wasn't really part of all of the exercises like it was in the 19th century.
Mm-hmm. So, if I was to encapsulate that, it's almost a shift from the cultivation of the practitioner to the cultivation of the audience. And then it becomes all about winning because you want to please that audience.
That was definitely a big part of it.
So in terms of the benefits of physical culture, have there been any modern studies or experiments that sort of like confirm some of those benefits, not just from like testimonies of practitioners in the 19th century, but things that are more recent?
There's not a lot in terms of mainstream studies. There's a resurgence that's been happening, a resurgence of interest. A small portion of it is very good. A large portion of it is they're just taking some of the old tools and implements from the 19th century, and they're applying a modern sort of bodybuilding athletic mindset to it. Mm-hmm. There are scholarly works that have been done on the history of physical education and things like that. So you can find stuff like that. I haven't found too much in the published literature that really gets at the heart of what makes this stuff so valuable and special. But from my view, like I was saying in the lecture, fencing is a branch of physical culture. So I feel that the people who have given lectures here today are part of physical culture, and certainly my experience at the Martinez Academy has given me I think incredible insight into the non-fencing exercises because of those shared objectives that I was talking about in the lecture. Does that answer it, or is?
Yeah, no, I think it does. I think it does. So I guess there was one other question around like, what do you think is going to be the next chapter for physical culture? I mean, it kind of went into eclipse for a lot of the 20th century. As you mentioned, there at least is, some communities that are developing interest. Everyone, who's been working as part of a tradition is carrying on tradition, as our other presenters are certainly part of that. But from your perspective, who's taking a wider view, are there any movements or developments that you find interesting or hopeful for the future?
There's been an explosion of interest recently, much in the same way that there was sort of this explosion of interest that happened 15, 20, 25 years ago with historical fencing. So it's sort of going in a similar direction, I think. And so you're going to see the people who are really attempting to carry on the traditions and understand the traditions are going to keep on doing what they're doing. And you're going to see, you've already seen this proliferation of stuff where they're applying a modern mindset, or everyone who's coming to it is bringing their own context and their own ideas to it. So some of it's being informed by, Filipino martial arts, some of it's being informed by bodybuilding. That's a huge topic of discussion. I would say that my feeling about it is very similar to my feelings about what's happening with fencing, whereas you do have a very limited handful of people, older people who know something, who are carrying on traditions of Indian clubs, wand technique, things like that. And a lot of these people are in their 80s or 90s, and they're not going to be around for much longer. So it's important. And some people are learning from them. It's certainly something that I'm interested in. But if you look at the level of interest, you'll find stuff on YouTube that's got, 1 million views and it's garbage. And then you'll look at a video by an actual master, true master, who's in his 80s and he's got, 50, the video has 50 views. So anyway, it's a big topic. And we'll see what happens in the next 10 to 20 years. But there's a lot of good people who are, I think, interested in this stuff. And yeah, anything more specific I can get into, but
yeah, well, it is. And I think that what we've learned from all of our presenters is that each one has done I think a masterful job of trying to compress a huge topic into a small amount of time. So thank you again, Mr. Miller, for joining us. And I'm afraid I'm going to have to say we are pretty much out of time. We've gone almost, we've gone half an hour over, and I can't ask for any more time from our presenters or for you, the audience. So again, thanks everyone for your attendance here at the Grand Assault of Arms for 2021. We, of course, hope to have the full event in 2022. But we have to be prepared for circumstances that remain a bit beyond our control. But we have recorded these presentations. We have the original recordings. All of these will be published in due course as part of the educational mission for the Association of Historical Fencing. If you want to support the association, you can become a member and help us with your membership fees to provide for more resources to cultivate these types of discussions, these types of events, and preserve and extend the knowledge of classical and historical fencing for future generations.